Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. This is going to be a 40-minute session talking about the manga and anime One Punch Man, seen through the lens of the death drive, as well as a discussion of the surplus enjoyment of video games. And finally, I would like to talk about the film Match Point and some other ideas relating to the Lacanian imaginary real, the symbolic real, and the real real. If you're new here, welcome. This is a weekly session that I've been hosting for more than 3 years now. I used to work as a lecturer at the University of Oxford Brookes, and when the pandemic forced our university to shut down, I started hosting these lectures. So they're free for anybody to join if you're interested in philosophy and theory, and if you'd like to learn about it in an accessible and hopefully enjoyable way, then you've come to the right place. A huge thank you to our patrons who continue to support this endeavor. If you'd like to download my ebook and all of my lectures, you can find them on Patreon. The link is www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy, and I'll put the information in my bio as well. Please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining us from. It makes me very happy to know that we are connecting from around the world. So please do let me know where you're tuning in from. I am currently in Eastern Washington, in Spokane, in my home library, in my study. I see someone joining in from planet Earth. Welcome. Hope you enjoy it here. Philadelphia, Cardiff, Florida, India, Oceanside, California. Hello and welcome back. Indiana, Philippines. Hello. I'm actually very pleased that we have so many students in the Philippines. Indonesia, the Netherlands, Malaysia, Beirut, Berlin, Mumbai. It's incredible. Thank you. Brings me a lot of joy. Okay, so I want to start with briefly talking about the manga One Punch Man, in which we have and first I would say, I want to make the argument that One Punch Man is the perfect expression of a certain post-ideological malaise, and therefore very relatable, I would say. And the protagonist of One Punch Man, Saitama, is a young man who's essentially living a fairly alienated existence as an office worker. He has nothing to live for, he hates his job, no purpose in life. He's simply a salaryman. He's almost a Kafka-esque kind of hero. And one day he meets a monster in the street who's attacking a young boy. And he suddenly finds it in himself to muster up the courage to fight this monster. And this becomes a pivotal turning point in his life. He decides to start training to become a superhero. And he trains so hard that he loses all of his hair and becomes immensely powerful. He becomes the One Punch Man. His essential strength is that he can beat all of his opponents, no matter how strong, with a single punch. Now, it's important to note that this is a tragic comic manga in this precise sense, which is to say that Saitama is too strong for his own good. Saitama is looking for a challenge. He is looking for purpose. And yet, no matter how strong his opponent appears, he nevertheless beats them with a single punch. Therefore, in a sense, the alienation that he experienced as a salaryman living without purpose and nothing to live for is mirrored in the superhero he becomes. Which is to say, he becomes a superhero who has no challenge, has no purpose, has nothing that will draw him out of his boredom. Therefore, in a sense, he becomes a tragic figure. He is too strong for his own good. It's a variation on the theme, be careful what you wish for. Which means that fundamentally, Saitama, as a hero, cannot enjoy being a hero. It's too easy. It's important to note here that essentially this illustrates quite well the principle of surplus enjoyment. One of the central aspects of the psychoanalytic principle of surplus enjoyment is that we actually derive pleasure through and from struggle. We derive pleasure, paradoxically, from failure, or at least the possibility of failure. That, ironically, one of the easiest ways to achieve purpose in life is precisely to have something worth struggling for every day, something that you can fail at fruitfully over and over again. This is what, from a Lacanian perspective, is referred to as the symptom. The symptom is that which you cannot overcome, that which is in you more than yourself, something that you dedicate yourself to each and every day. And precisely in the futility of it, you realize your inner necessity, the person who you feel you truly are. For example, an artist or a writer will feel dissatisfied whenever they've completed their latest work. Even if it's their best work, a part of them will feel like they have to do it again. They have to do it again so as to do it better or to correct the mistakes from the previous work. This sense of dissatisfaction, however, secretly contains a kernel of enjoyment, what in psychoanalytic terms would be called surplus enjoyment. It's the surplus enjoyment of knowing that you can do it again, that you can, as Beckett once put it, fail again and fail better. Saitama, however, is barred from this central dimension of surplus enjoyment. Therefore, his strength, in a sense, makes him disconnected from the world. He is altogether too strong, and every once in a while he becomes excited when he meets an opponent who gives him the potential, the hope that he might have a challenge in life, that there might be an opponent worth fighting. And every single time he's disappointed. Essentially, he beats him with a single punch. Therefore, the entire fight, the entire struggle has been rendered meaningless. This means that there's a certain enjoyment to be had by measuring yourself against others. And I would argue that this surplus enjoyment is the same thing that you see when you play video games. A well-calibrated video game will essentially give you a challenge that is difficult to overcome, and yet fundamentally not impossible, which means that even though you're likely to fail the first time, if you keep working at it over and over again, you'll become incrementally better and be able to beat the level or beat the boss. And a well-designed video game will scale up the intensity and the difficulty in a manner that's commensurate with your effort, which is to say that the more time you put into it, the more skilled you become, the more difficult challenges the game will feed you. This means that the surplus enjoyment derived from playing the game fundamentally actually revolves around a kind of embrace of failure, which is simply another way of referring to repetition. After all, what is failure if not a form of repetition? You fail, and so you do it again. And the video games that are most satisfying are the ones which allow you to fail repeatedly whilst fundamentally, incrementally moving forward. What's really important here is therefore that a lot of video games have a dual structure, which is to say you have the lives in the game, but you also have the game over screen. And the game over screen ensures that the losing of life doesn't become merely repetitive, merely rote, which is how it would lose its meaning. Which means that against the backdrop of repetitive failure and perseverance, we have the overarching symbolic horizon of the game over screen, the screen that signifies that you have lost all of your lives. And the secret of the surplus enjoyment therein doesn't lie merely in the repetition of failure, but precisely within the symbolic game over screen. What's important, therefore, is that the repetition of failure in and of itself doesn't make one happy or living with purpose. After all, you would be miserable if you did something over and over again simply to fail at it and become incrementally better. What makes it worthwhile is the overarching symbolic end of the game over screen. The same is true for life, of course. It's because we know that we are finite beings. It's because we know that there is an end to our lifespan, that we look for something that we can try to hone over repeated failures throughout the course of our life, to become a skilled craftsman, to become an artist or a writer, or whatever you enjoy becoming incrementally better at, retains its purpose precisely because you know that there is an end, that there is a game over screen. Of course, the video game is a simulacrum, which is to say the game over screen itself isn't truly the end. When you reach the game over screen, you can reboot the game. And yet most games will put you at a disadvantage. They'll bring you back to the beginning, or they'll take away some of the skills or powers that you've accrued over time. Therefore, in a sense, the game over screen represents the reset button of the surplus enjoyment. You start over. It's a little bit, it's not exactly the right link to make here, but you could make an argument here that the game over screen, therefore, relates to the Nietzschean notion of eternal transference, that you simply do it over and over and over again, precisely because you've reached the internal limit of the thing. Now, the reason that Saitama, to my mind, is therefore an existential hero is that he reflects a certain post-ideological malaise, as I said before. One of the central aspects of the idea of post-ideology, or of living in a post-ideological world, is that we fundamentally no longer believe, or are no longer supposed to believe, in any kind of overarching ideological meta-narratives. This starts with the idea of the death of God. The idea of the death of God means that you're supposed to be abandoned. You live in a world in which there is no God. What therefore represents itself as an emancipatory gesture, namely the possibility of the subject to create his own reality, unbound and untethered by the idea of a man in the sky telling you what to do and how to live, therefore becomes an existential dilemma, which is to say, if there is no God, then we must invent a God. We must invent some symbolic external figure that we can submit our actions to and for. Think about it. Artistic creativity, until the idea of the death of God, fundamentally served to illustrate the grace of God, whether it was through the depiction of beauty and landscape, or if it was through the creation of artifacts for churches. Fundamentally, therefore, the worshiping of the ideal created an entire artistic field of expression that allowed people to hone their craft and their artistic talent. After the death of God, we have to find different ways of expressing this kind of creative energy. It shifts towards becoming a more modern approach that art should serve the people, and it should serve potentially the state, which is, of course, one of the ideological accidents of history, as it were, when we start having propaganda and art that serves a state narrative. But it also becomes about the individual expression of the subject. What does it mean to live in a world that is unbound by the possibility of God? What does it mean to live in an existential place in which the search for something revolves around the search for meaning itself? This is essentially Camus' proposition in his absurdist masterpiece, Waiting for Godot, is that, strictly speaking, these two characters don't know what they're waiting for. They don't know why they're there. There's a tragic comic element to Waiting for Godot that almost mirrors a little bit what happens to Saitama in One Punch Man, which is that they're the ones who have survived the war, the conflicts. They're living in a wasteland, and yet they have nothing to live for, except the idea of something to live for that will one day appear to them. Therefore, the fundamental tragicomic essence of Waiting for Godot is what is perhaps the most contemporary modern symptom, which is boredom. It's the inexpressible discomfort of not knowing what to do with yourself and yet experiencing the fact that you have every possibility of so doing. This is what Kierkegaard called the dizziness of freedom. Kierkegaard described it like this. He said, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Namely, you could do everything. You fundamentally are your own master. But because you could do everything, you suddenly feel overwhelmed by the burden of having to choose what it is that you would like to commit yourself to. This means that fundamentally you are lost. You are in a wilderness. You don't have any stars to govern you like a compass. And fundamentally, this therefore is the question of all modern subjectivity. What to do in a world that is defined by the secular turn, or the idea of the death of God. What happens after the so-called post-ideological turn of the 1980s, in which the grand meta-narratives of communism versus capitalism, etc., seem to be at least laid to rest, the question becomes how to live in a world that no longer has ideological significance, how to commit to a project that is one's own life, that is no longer bound to the notion of an ideological commitment to a cause. Therefore, the new imperative within the post-ideological world becomes be happy. Be as happy as you can be. It's like the Pharrell song. Happiness becomes an imperative. Well-being becomes an imperative for the subject. Self-care and self-love becomes an imperative. And whilst these are not necessarily bad things, of course, everyone should take care of themselves, it means that you have made yourself your own God, which means that we enter into the era of narcissism. The era of narcissism is simply when you have made yourself into God, when you worship yourself, when you serve yourself alone. And then the entire creative energy that you experience becomes about the reproduction of the deity, which is yourself, posting perfect pictures online, representing your lifestyle to others, demonstrating wealth and status and success and happiness. Therefore, you are worshiping at the altar, which is the altar of your own self. And you can see here the trajectory, which is the trajectory from worshiping a god to worshiping an ideological program to worshiping the self. And once you worship yourself, this means that fundamentally a certain boredom sets in, a certain malaise sets in, which is that You are staging the idea of a happy selfhood to others, and yet fundamentally there is nothing behind the facade. You no longer know why you should do something. You pick up a book, what's the point? And so we start using a certain productivity lens to justify everything we do. I'm going to read so that I can consume information. I'm going to read faster so that I can be a more productive reader. I'm going to look for points that can make me more happy or more productive at my job. We start seeing everything around us, all the creative expressions of human existence, as a mere facilitator of further expression of productivity and happiness to others. This means that we risk becoming alienated subjects once again. That in serving our own cause, the idea of being happy and fulfilled, etc., we simply become alienated from what it means to be alive in the first place. And as I said in other videos before, I think that the essence of what it means to be alive is to become subject to others, to express love to others. And love can take on many forms. It can be about teaching. When you teach and you transfer knowledge and information to others, you are expressing an act of love. You are giving something without wanting anything in return. But it can also be the creation of art or music. You are sharing something with others and you don't necessarily want something in return for it. To become subject to others, therefore, is precisely the opposite of worshiping at the altar of your own selfhood. It's to say, I'm going to do something that other people can benefit or derive pleasure from. Now, fundamentally, of course, the trap here is to say that you start only identifying as being someone who can provide joy to others. In other words, you only exist if you are seen, you only exist if you are heard, which means that we become stuck in a kind of loop by which we only exist to the extent that we can be recognized or seen by other people, and we're back at the Sartrean maxim, hell is other people. Therefore, fundamentally, to go back to One Punch Man, I think the reason that Saitama is so relatable in One Punch Man is because he reflects a certain general tendency, which is that we're aware of the futility of most things, and yet we're also unhappy being bored. And if we try to do something with ourselves, we start seeing through it. We start worrying that we're doing it for the wrong purposes. And Saitama is the most universal contemporary hero because he has nothing to live for except a challenge which has been withheld from him. He is alone. By means of his very strength, by means of having access to everything which is good, his life becomes too easy. There is no struggle. There is nothing to live for. There is no failure in his life. Failure, therefore, becomes one of the constitutive features of a happy, fulfilled existence. And this is similar to the psychoanalytic principle of the death drive. The psychoanalytic principle of the death drive was never about an imminent movement towards death or a self-destructive tendency. It was about the fact that we feel most alive precisely when we do something in which we disappear. Whether it's climbing a mountain, whether it's reading a really difficult book, whether it's, for Hegel, even being in combat, you disappear into negation. You disappear into struggle or opposition, and therein precisely you find yourself. This is what Hegel characterized as the night of the world. It's that the subject encounters himself in absolute negation. Therefore, the idea that it would be the reverse, that you would have to look into yourself to find yourself, is anathema to the idea of the Hegelian night of the world or the Freudian death drive. It's the other way around. It's when you lose yourself in something, when you become subject to something completely, that you paradoxically find yourself at the end of the tunnel. Now, I want to briefly say here that fundamentally, to go back to this idea of video games, when you play a video game, you have the two horizons. Remember, you have the video games in your life that are your lives, like 1 life, 2 life, 3 life, and then you have the overarching screen of the game over screen, right? Now, fundamentally, what's really important here is that there has to be an element of arbitrariness here, which is to say, if the video game simply purely reflected a kind of meritocracy, by which everything that happened was a measure of your skill, it would lose the element of surplus enjoyment. Which is to say that every really good video game has an element of what appears to be luck. In fact, this is true for all surplus enjoyment. If everything in the world was, strictly speaking, a meritocracy, and a pure reflection of your own personal investment, you would actually lose interest, or at least you would lose joy in it. One of the beauties of the participation in any form of game or competition is precisely this immeasurable component, which we call luck. Think about like a sports game, for example. If you're watching a competition between two teams, what makes it enjoyable is that you know which team is supposed to win, and yet you never know if it's going to be one of those nights in which an upset is caused, in which the team that is not as skilled wins. And even within the span of a regular game, you will see multiple moments that are purely based on luck. How a ball bounces, how the wind is blowing. Certain factors come together in a way that doesn't make sense, that therefore lends the game its sense of spontaneous joy. Fundamentally, therefore, in a skill of competition, what we really derive pleasure from is precisely this component which we cannot measure. In fact, I think betting wouldn't exist, and sports betting wouldn't exist, if it weren't for the pleasure of anticipating that which cannot be anticipated. It's much more rewarding to place a bet on the person who will never win than it is to place a bet on the person who is likely to win. Therefore, you could make the argument that in the same way that in a video game we have two levels of failure, namely the lives and then the game over screen, that the same is true when it comes to competition or struggle, which is to say, on the one hand, we enjoy the negation of two people facing off, but secretly what we enjoy is the inexpressible element of surprise that comes through this competition, in fact, which can only emerge through this competition, which is to say that the surplus enjoyment of struggle is never simply the negation of struggle itself. This would be altogether too Nietzschean, perhaps even proto-fascist, the same way in which World War I, of course, World War I wasn't fascist, but in which World War I soldiers were given books, little books with Nietzschean maxims about being strong and growing through struggle, etc. The point isn't that you derive surplus enjoyment from struggle. In fact, struggle and hardship by itself doesn't bring you joy. I think this is actually a simplification that is often said by people who don't have a lot of struggle in their life. I think many people struggle and experience hardship and pain and don't derive joy or surplus enjoyment from it. The surplus enjoyment, instead, derives from this spontaneous or seemingly spontaneous essence of a kind of unpredictable nature of luck that emerges when we have the staging of competition, which in other words is the staging of a theatrical version of struggle. It's not that we look at gladiators who are literally fighting each other to the death. It's that we look at well-paid athletes who are fighting each other for points. Therefore, what we find enjoyable about this isn't simply the measuring of two different strengths. It's the unexpected component that comes with it. There's a great line about this from Woody Allen's film Match Point. Towards the end, we see a slow motion shot of a tennis net, and there's a ball that's crossing the tennis net. And the voiceover narrator says, "I've always thought that it's better to be lucky than to be good. Because every once in a while when you play tennis, the ball hits the top of the net. And for a moment, it doesn't matter how good you are. All that matters is, will it fall inside or outside of your side of the court?" In other words, the true pleasure of the game isn't simply the measuring of skill. It's being lucky in the moment that counts. In a sense, you could even say that it's better to be lucky than good, seen through the lens of Saitama in One Punch Man. He is too good. He is so good, so absolutely strong, that luck is no longer a component, which means that therefore joy and surplus enjoyment is no longer a factor of his competition. Whenever he meets an opponent, he knows that he will beat them in one punch. Therefore, there is no challenge, there is no luck, there's not that mystical thing which somehow happens to even the best players, which is that they can lose if they are unlucky. Now, what's important here is that for Woody Allen and Match Point, the net therefore represents this thing that cannot be incorporated into the meritocratic competition of skill. It's that when the ball hits the net, it could bounce either way. And where Match Point is a little bit disappointing is that it seems to imply that this is simply fate. But I think it would be much more accurate to say that the ball hitting the net is much more akin to the Lacanian concept of the imaginary real. The imaginary real is a kind of excessive phantasmatic content that we encounter and that somehow exists within the overarching horizon of the symbolic meaning of our participation in social life. It's a little bit like believing that there's a karma or luck behind the things that you do. It's not something that you can look at directly, and yet somehow it nevertheless sustains your participation. Think about it again. If you're playing tennis and it's simply about who's the better player, then you're going to lose your enjoyment in the game because you know in the beginning already who's going to win. It's precisely this extra component, this excessive phantasmatic investment of luck, of the unpredictable, that makes it a pleasurable game. And what's important to note here is that Lacan actually has, in his famous triad of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, he actually has, if you will, a much more multi-layered conception, something that Slavoj Žižka has written about, which is to say that instead of simply having the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, we also have the real, the symbolic real, and the imaginary real. I'll give you an example of the real. It's basically when we have an intrusion of a horrific, insurmountable symbol of that which cannot be confronted, that which we cannot cope with, that which we have to disavow. The classic example within cinema is Jaws. Jaws can be interpreted as another expression of post-ideological / postmodern cinema, in which life is supposed to be perfect and you're at the beach and there's no problem ever, and yet all of a sudden there's this monstrous figure that emerges out of the deep that represents all the repressed anguish and fear. Everything that you're supposed to disavow comes back and bites you. It's the return of the repressed, as it were, in the figure of the monstrous shark. Here we have the real, the encounter with the return of the repressed, as it were. You could see a contemporary example of this in the movie Barbie. Barbie is living in Barbie land and everything is perfect and the milk is never spoiled and every day the water temperature is perfect, etc. And she lives a sing-song, happy utopian reality. And then amidst her dance party, she suddenly has intrusive thoughts of death. This is the real. This is the thing that you can't confront suddenly coming at you, as it were. It could be the alien in the Alien movies that comes out of the stomach, etc. Now, the symbolic real, on the other hand, is completely different. The symbolic real can best be exemplified by mathematical formulas. Mathematical formulas that represent something which we cannot access, and yet that nevertheless are foundational for how we understand reality. For example, when somebody expresses to you E is mc squared, we don't, unless you're like really invested in mathematics, algebra, and physics, you're not really going to know what it means. Somebody can explain to you what it means, and you can have an idea of what it means. But to really understand the form and to be able to calculate it yourself is a whole nother level of skill. Now, fundamentally, this doesn't mean that you have to learn how to calculate it. You have to, in a certain way, believe that it is true. You have to assume that these formulas work. And fundamentally, the reason that this is the symbolic real is because, strictly speaking, the naive approach is the true one, which is algebra is just numbers. It's just letters, as it were. It's just a formal representation of something which is so difficult to conceptualize on a purely symbolic level that we have to put it into mathematical formulas. This is one of the beauties, I think, about the human brain, which is to say that there are certain things that we can't think, that we can't conceptualize, unless we create these layers of formal analysis through which we can momentarily conceptualize it. If you've ever studied math, you may have had this experience where you've calculated something, and for a moment it's in your head and you know the truth of it, but then as soon as you lose all the preceding steps, suddenly it disappears, like smoke. Here we have the symbolic real. It's a stand-in for something which cannot be conceptualized, which temporarily, or perhaps eternally, if you think of the laws of nature, finds representation in what is essentially an arbitrary formula. There's a great line in the movie Oppenheimer that I think illustrates this quite well, where Oppenheimer is still a young man studying at the University of Heidelberg, and his mentor says to him, "Algebra is like sheet music. The question isn't, can you read it? The question is, can you hear the music?" And this is the symbolic real. The symbolic real isn't, can you understand the formal components of the symbol which represents reality? It's, can you hear the music? Can you make it real in your head, as it were? And the symbolic real, I think, can even be expressed in a literary sense. In the same way that Roland Barthes argued for the death of the author, which in other words that a text, in order to become a text, has to be completed by the reader, we have here the symbolic real. A book becomes a book when somebody reads it. A piece of music becomes a piece of music when someone hears the music. And a mathematical truth becomes a mathematical truth when other people can do the same calculations and attempt to falsify it. Now, we've already expressed, therefore, the idea of the real, the shocking intrusion of the return of the repressed, that which cannot be confronted and which therefore has to be disavowed so as to uphold a social reality, versus the symbolic real, which is ironically the formulas that underpin social reality, or the contemplation of that which cannot be depicted in any figurative sense. E is mc squared can't be put in terms of a picture, like in a picture book. It's something that you have to understand what the algebraic formula is a reference to. And then we have the imaginary real. And like I said before, the imaginary real is this kind of excessive phantasmatic substance that we can't directly access. There's no way of symbolically representing it. Instead, it becomes the backdrop of that which sustains our investment in the symbolic and in the real. And this is why I think it's important to talk about that scene from Match Point, where the tennis ball hits the net, and for a moment you don't know on which side it's going to fall. Here in this moment of indeterminateness, which we can only attribute to luck, of course we could come up with a mathematical formula that would attempt to calculate how the hitting of the ball and the wind resistance made it so that the ball would exactly hit the net in that certain moment, and we could calculate whether or not it would fall on the left side or the right side, but fundamentally it's too late. It doesn't matter. It couldn't be done in the moment. Therefore, we have to attribute this moment in which the ball falls either left or right to arbitrariness, to a certain type of luck. And the secret is that surplus enjoyment, the investment that we derive from participation in the symbolic order, derives and hinges precisely upon this arbitrary, imaginary real, this layering, this backdrop that somehow makes the investment in everything else purposeful. To go back to One Punch Man, if One Punch Man were slightly less powerful, if he would find someone who could beat him, then he would be able to participate in social life. Then he would find purpose, something to live for, something to fight for. But because he can't find anyone who can actually challenge him, he's forced to exist in a state of boredom, a state of post-ideological malaise in which there's nothing to live for anymore. Therefore, Saitama becomes a representative of somebody who exists outside the socio-symbolic order. In a sense, he himself has become a god at this point. That is his tragedy. He himself has become someone to be worshipped by others who would like to become like him. And the important point here is that when Saitama is asked how he became so strong, his answer is never about some mystical secret that you could, learn so as to achieve his godhood. Instead, it's always a non-answer. The secret is that there is no secret. He says he just did a lot of push-ups and his hair fell out and he became the strongest person on the planet. Therefore, we once again have what is essentially a joke about a post-ideological expression, which is that the highest is no longer ideal or transcendental in any sense. It simply is. It's simply boring. The answer for why he became so strong is, strictly speaking, boring, which reflects the boring nature of his existence, because he has no investment in the world, because he has no sense of struggle or anything to fight for. Therefore, Saitama becomes representative of somebody who can no longer experience joy, can no longer experience surplus enjoyment, because he no longer lives in the universe in which we have arbitrary occurrences that could bring about his demise. And so you could make the argument that we go from a death of God world to the death of ideology world to the death of the subject world. A subject who has so completely been able to optimize himself and become so strong that there is nothing to live for, that there is nothing that brings joy anymore. And think about it, like all things that bring a metaphysical or transcendental dimension are fundamentally disruptive in this precise sense. Love, at its core, is a disruption. It's a disruption of your habits. It's a disruption of the perfect routines that you've created for yourself. It can make you sleep less or sleep poorly. It can make you stop eating. It can make you really miserable. Love emerges as an interruption in your life, which is precisely why it's something that is supposed to bring the subject back to life. If you completely perfect your life and you become the strongest, happiest, most attractive version of yourself, then you've lost something. And so love presents itself in this precise sense as what Alain Badiou would call a truth event. It happens to the subject and challenges the subject to see his truth reflected back into it. It's a seemingly contingent event. Therefore, one of the important things to understand about Alain Badiou's theory of the event is that it's a kind of transcendental or metaphysical response to the malaise of the post-ideological existence, which is to say that in a world in which we no longer follow, necessarily, not true for everyone, but in which we no longer follow God as the Father in the sky, and in a world in which we don't follow ideological doctrines, in which we're supposed to exist in a state of pure self-enrichment and self-optimization, ironically, what we're really craving, the only way in which the event or the truth event can take place for us, is precisely through the eruption of something irreconcilable with our happiness. An event that ruptures or shatters the frame of view that we have through which we access reality, in which we find a call, a realization of something higher that we have to make ourselves subject to. Now, of course, this can be love. It can be that you suddenly meet somebody and suddenly you can't imagine not being with them. But it can also be a political or revolutionary cause. It can be an artistic project. It can be something that is so important to you that you want to dedicate your life to it. Therefore, fundamentally, to be subject, and this is one of the key lessons of the death drive, one of the key aspects of subjectivity is to realize that you are your symptom. That the symptom isn't simply something to be rid of. Failure isn't something to never experience. Heartbreak isn't something to never experience. Loss isn't something you never experience. It's precisely when you embrace these things that true subjectivity emerges. Which is to say, true subjectivity emerges through challenge. It emerges through the very things that try to undermine your sense of self. If art is the representation of contradiction, in other words, not only the contradiction of somebody else's point of view, but the contradictory ways in which reality can be depicted, then life itself becomes more rich when it becomes more contradictory. When we experience overlapping or contradictory emotions, when we do things that we cannot fully explain to ourselves, therein we find subjectivity. And so what I'd like to end this lecture on is briefly to say that it's very difficult, I think, in today's world to find a reason to exist, to find a reason to live. In fact, any person who has any degree of intelligence will quickly understand the hopelessness or seeming hopelessness of our situation, whether it's global conflict, whether it's the perpetuating injustices of economic injustice and climate change, whether it's the fact that we're all so happy and so rich and so we have so many opportunities and yet somehow it doesn't feel like it means anything, whether it's going to a job that you hate, whether it's doing something that you think is simply a waste of time so that you can make some money, so that you can buy some food and play some video games, but at the end of the day, you still feel hollow inside. This type of existential anxiety is what we used to call alienation. It's a feeling of disconnect. In fact, it's a feeling of indifference almost to what's happening in the world. Because to acknowledge it would be to invite a level of contradiction into your life that would be irreconcilable with the idea and the notion of a happy, productive self. And therefore, we do the best we can to participate in life, to do all the things we're supposed to do. And yet fundamentally, there's a nagging sensation that it is not enough, that we're not doing something that really has meaning. Therefore, the search for meaning emerges as, if you will, the central curse of all existence, which is to say that you're looking for it, but you're not finding it. And when you don't find it, it feels like you're wasting your time. Like life suddenly becomes, a ticking clock, as it were. And I think the central realization that I attribute to the idea of the death drive is that the search for meaning is itself meaning. The search for struggle is itself meaning. The search for that which you will never truly be able to reach is itself what is worth reaching. And therefore, everyone has to find something that they can measure themselves against, that they can fail at, that they can fruitfully fail at. And this is the Lacanian maxim, and of course we risk turning it into a self-help maxim here, but the Lacanian idea is that you have to essentially identify with your symptom. That you have to realize that this failure to ever be the person you fully want to be have said the things you wanted to say and do the things you want to do and be the partner you want to be, that these things are exactly the point. You embrace and identify with your symptom. And ironically, of course, we're now back at what appears to be a transcendental religious position. After all, what is a monk if not somebody who identifies with his symptom, who has put his life aside so as to worship God? What is an artist if not someone who has put their time aside so as to worship at the altar of creativity and human expression? What is a scholar if not someone who has put their life aside so as to learn as much as possible? Therefore, in a sense, we become fools. We become holy idiots. We do something which we know is pointless and yet which gives us satisfaction. And once again, to go back to the video game screen, what sustains it is the game over scream at the end. It wouldn't be meaningful if it didn't have an end. It wouldn't have meaning if it weren't finite. Ironically, the secret for living forever, the secret of eternity, is precisely to embrace your finitude, which is to say, eternity isn't simply having more time. It's not about having 10 times or 100 times or 1,000,000 times your lifespan. It's not life without end. It's the other way around. When you fully absorb yourself in your commitment, in your symptom, in what you're happiest doing, your art, your gardening, your writing, your project, your family, that's when you feel like you're living forever. Immortality is simply a full-on embrace of the present. And therefore, finitude and eternity don't become opposites. It's not eternity is what we don't have because we're finite beings. It's precisely because we're finite beings, because we have the overarching game over screen, that we can find eternity within the present. And all maxims about living in the present aside, this is the fundamental proposition of the idea of transcendence. Transcendence isn't, I'm going to enter through the pearly gates into heaven and be saved. Transcendence is experiencing the eternal in the present, or the eternal present, as it were. And now you can understand that that's how love works. That's how being subject to something works. When you're together, you are living in the eternal present of each other's love. When you are teaching your students, you're living in the eternal present of your educational exchange. When you're cooking and sharing a meal with people, you're living in the eternal present of consuming a meal together. Therefore, eternity and the transcendental mechanism of immortality exists only in the present, only in the finite. And therefore, to go back to Kierkegaard, to express that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, in other words, when you're paralyzed because you think there's so many other things you could do, you have to see it the opposite way, which is why Kierkegaard encourages a leap of faith. A leap of faith means saying, it's not that I could do anything, it's that I will do one thing, and I will do it fully, completely. I will commit myself completely to this thing. I will make myself subject and subservient to it. Which means that when you dive in head first, with no guarantee whether or not it will be successful, when you truly go for something, you will find a sense of eternity. You will find yourself. So don't go looking for yourself inside yourself. Find yourself outside yourself. That's what I would say as a quote-unquote lesson at the end of this lecture. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope that you've enjoyed this live stream session. Thank you for watching my videos. And please don't forget, as a patron, you can also download all of my lectures as well as my ebook. The link is in my bio. See you next week.